Chapter 718, Chapter 95. Today we're going to move into the American Land Title Association standards. These standards are not, they're not rules, they're just guidelines by which the banks and the real estate people want to see surveys completed in a standard manner across the U.S. The original Land Title Association was started back in 1907, and from over time they've adapted the rules. They recently adapted the rules in February of 2016, and that is the latest release. They are no longer American ACSM standards because ACSM split, the American Congress on Surveying and Mapping split from the NSPS, National Society of Professional Surveyors, and many of the surveys that you will encounter in your careers will be ALTA surveys. The downside of ALTA surveys is most banks just know the buzzword and don't necessarily know what goes into an ALTA survey. And what it did was it tried to unify the guidelines of what would be put onto a survey across the nation so that there was a standard. And it's good, and it can certainly exceed when we get into the end of this lecture and we start to look at Table A, and we can see that that many of the things that may be required on an ALTA survey are way beyond what you would put onto a standard of practice survey in Florida or in whatever state you're practicing in. So it's a checklist that the bank actually has to check off. So when someone asks you for an ALTA survey, first question that you always ask is do you have a Table A, and can you send it over to me? And it also would require a title report, a title commitment. So these are the things that we'll discuss today, and as we move forward. A quick review of where we are in the process in our lecture series. We started with the big picture, then we moved into the rules. We started into the regulatory environment. And our series 1 was practice of surveying and mapping. We gave you an overview. We talked about the business functions and how to operate as a new SIT, your response to daily work demands, time, cost, and schedule management. We had a lecture on that. And client and business proposals, which at this point I have graded quiz number 1, and I have also looked at your sample contracts and your comments back. Some were very thorough and asked a lot of good questions, and I've responded to all of those. Take a look at those in Canvas, and if you have any additional questions, please let me know. Today we continue with professional regulation. Again, in our last lecture, we discussed Chapter 718. We talked about Chapter 95, adverse possession. Today, our focus will be on these American Land Title Association, NSPS standards, and national industry standards. They are, remember, this is an association. It's not tied to legislation like your technical standards in each of your individual states would be. So it's a little bit different scenario. It's something that ties back again to the real estate people and to the banks that are lending money and financing and taking the liability of property. The purpose of the ALTA surveys was that, and it sums it up best here, members of the American Land Title Association have specific needs unique to title insurance matters when asked to insure title to land, without exception as to the many matters which might be discoverable from a survey. Remember, you are reporting the facts, and that includes the survey, the inspection, and anything that's not evidenced by the public records. Important statement there, not evidenced by the public records. So your job is to show them everything that exists on the ground All of the research that you've done as far as plotting easements, many times setbacks, underground utilities, all of the things associated with the closing on property that may be important from a title insurance perspective. What I'm going to try to do today is just highlight on the important issues and let you come back with questions in a discussion group to answer any remaining questions that you still have. One of the first things that you see when someone asks for an ALTA survey is most banks usually don't have an idea what Table A is. So it has to specify, everybody specifies they want an ALTA ACSM land title survey, but they don't really know what they're asking for when they do that. So the interesting thing is that you will end up asking them about Table A. They will many times not understand what you're asking for, so now you'll send it over to them. In many cases, what you can do is you can mark up everything that you think they might need. Don't overshoot yourselves and put things in there that they may not be asking for, because then they will ask for it. Everything that you add will drive up the price of the survey. And just keep that in mind when you're filling out a Table A or having them fill it out. This section discusses surveying standards and standard of care. Remember that in Florida and in other states that you may be surveying in, you usually have surveying requirements. Most surveying rules, ours in Florida do this. They say that if the standard is higher than what the standard of practice calls for, then you have the obligation to fulfill those standards. This slide kind of outlines what's required, and that you do have to meet the specifications in certain jurisdictions where the rules may be, or the guidelines may be more intense than what you would normally be asked for. And this just kind of qualifies the fact that you can obviously survey to a higher standard as required. This section discusses measurement standards. Remember that as we went through 5J17, went through the rules, we do have a standard of care that is a survey grade type allowable error. Here they talk a little bit about relative positional precision. That is of course your GPS, your high technologies, your least squares adjustments, your error analysis, your ellipsoids, what kind of error are you allowed. That's going to usually be defined by your state. Also, the boundary lines are defined here, and you're looking at the conditions of the site, the age of the monuments, you're tying those in, the adjoiners, occupation lines, all the things that you will have to measure to an accurate scale so that it can be relied on by the title insurance companies. The ALTA standards tried to cover it all. They tried to cover the use of trained personnel, for example, that you will have qualified people in the field, how to compensate for systematic errors in your equipment, regular testing and checking to make sure all your centering errors and your instruments were properly calibrated. How often were they calibrated? Using the proper error propagation techniques, whether you're going to use a compass rule adjustment or using a least squares adjustment, how you're going to do it. You have to meet a certain positional accuracy, and they've defined that here in this section. Again, if you have questions on that, please bring it up in the discussion group. This section speaks of records research and title commitments. Very important here. The thing that I would point out from experience is that title reports, the title commitment is something that should be in your surveyor's report. Usually there's a time and date on the title commitment. It's important that you list that, because I've seen this in the past. Many times the title commitment will get updated and you may or may not get a copy of that. And then you end up getting the phone call from the bank or from the title attorney saying, hey, you did not show this on your survey. So it's important that you list the exact time and date of that title commitment, because the new title commitment may just be an amendment. And if it's an amendment, it may have the same number. And if it has the same number, that's fine, but what is the time and date? Because I have seen in my experience that there's a new title commitment, you didn't get it. And once you research it, you can call them back and say, listen, it was not in the title commitment that I was provided to prepare this survey. I'll be happy to update the survey to show the current information, but now I'm going to need the new title commitment in order to do so. And there is an additional fee for that time on your part to update that survey. This slide is pretty important in terms of, in order to complete an ALTA survey, you must get the following information. Think about this. We are the surveyors of fact. We are not the legal side of it, but the title attorney, the one that produces the title commitment, is showing you all issues, or should show you all the issues that affect that property. So the title, when you request a title commitment, you can tell them you want to go back 25 years, you want to go back 50 years, you want to go back even farther if it's that important. But the most important thing for you to remember as a surveyor is they're providing you with that information, and you're basing your survey on that information. So public records, any recorded easements, anything that the attorney thinks is maybe an encumbrance to the property, he puts into Schedule B2, and you have to address those issues. But it's always going to be based on what they gave you as a title commitment. Now, there is an additional obligation on your part as a surveyor that if you see something that a visual observation on the site of a utility easement or something that wasn't provided in your title commitment, you do have an obligation to go back to the title attorney and say, listen, I found evidence of this easement. Also, what comes into play here is prescriptive rights. There are things something that I started to do many years ago was to superimpose an aerial on top of a boundary survey. Let's say, for example, you have an undeveloped piece of property and it's covered with, the kids have been riding ATCs out there, and it's laced with trails all through the property. Okay, someone may come back and claim prescriptive rights to that in the future. So you as the surveyor, the way I look at it is shown or noted on the survey. So if you superimpose an aerial, that is shown, and you can address that in your title report, in your surveyor's report, that says numerous ATC trails, and I'm just using this as an example. Numerous ATC trails throughout the site were not field located, but are as shown on the survey. So you've kind of covered yourself too. You got to remember, it's all about liability and protecting yourself as well as the public. I'll be very short on this slide. This is the except however statement. If the documents outlined above in the two sections above are not provided to the surveyor, or if non-public or quasi-public documents are required to complete the surveyor shall be required to conduct only that research which is part of his contractual obligation. Okay, so you, again, you can start to really understand now why I say document everything. If you see it, truth in labeling, put it in your surveyor's report, the time and date of that title commitment, because if they update it, it'll have a different time and date. And at least you can say, no, I showed everything that you gave me in the title commitment, and that was my contractual obligation. So just make sure that you cover yourself. This is a change in 2016. This was not in the 2011 ALTA standards. At this point, we've described all of the information that needs to be on a survey, either through 5J17 or what we've covered so far in the ALTA standards. Remember that the ALTA standards are just in many cases, a higher level of survey than just your standard of practice. So all of the monuments being shown on the survey, that's that's going to be done regardless of whether you're doing an ALTA survey or not. So many of the things that you see are things that you would do anyway. But when you get into Table A, now is where it starts to define the things that are over and above what you would normally do in a standard survey. When you're doing that, you're talking about things like setbacks and zoning restrictions and underground utilities that may not just have to be designated, have to be located. So all of these things drive up the cost of a survey, and depending on what they're actually looking for on the deliverable is something that you will have to price and provide. This is just a continuation of the last slide. Right of way, access to right of ways, all of that information. You just recently submitted the easement description for the fiber optic line, and I noticed on some of the sketches and legals that you provided, you didn't really cover all of the right of way, the things that would help you define where this is in the world and where this is in location to this survey. So these are all important points too. The more information you put on a survey, the better your reputation is going to be as you move through your career. Names, street addresses, public, private, abutting properties. That's a requirement of 5J17 in Florida. It's probably a requirement in any other state that you're working in. Visible evidence. We call it apparent physical use here in Florida, rather than encroachment, because an encroachment is you are making a decision as to whether it is or it is not an issue, whereas an apparent physical use puts it back onto the attorney to determine whether he feels that's an encroachment. So don't you call it out as an encroachment, call it out as apparent physical evidence, and let the courts and the legal side define whether that's an issue or not. So location, vehicular, pedestrian, all these forms come into play as you're completing this survey. There's not a whole lot to say here that we didn't say in the last slide. Remember, the more information that you put on the survey, you need to read through these statements and decide whether you have any other questions on them. Most of it is pretty self-evident, but the more, as I said earlier, the more information you put on the survey, the better the product is going to be. I won't spend a lot of time on this slide. Basically, it's talking about those lines of possession and improvements along boundaries. It's important here to note that you are not expressing a legal opinion on the information that you show on a survey, and you want to be very careful to not do that. If you do, then you're delving into that legal side. Your job is to show the facts. If there is a fence line that crosses the line, obviously that would be some type of encroachment either from one side or the other. But if it's completely off the property or completely on the property, you really have no way of knowing whether which owner owns it. So your job is just to show the information and let the title attorneys do the legal side of that operation and figure out where the ownership lies. It is also important in your surveys to show things that may not appear in the title commitment, such as evidence of easements where you have no easement recording, but yet there may be a utility, or you may see things that appear to be an easement or some kind of servitude burdening the property. And it's your job as a surveyor to also report that information, even if you don't have any record of an easement document and there's a utility or some other use of that land. You need to show the apparent use. Physical apparent use is a term that you should get very used to hearing in the surveying profession. Again, this slide speaks of apparent use. in a cemetery, for example, are the plots all marked in the field? Do they have boundary markers? I've recently done some work for the Veterans Administration with so many casualties coming back from our wars in other countries. Um, there's been a big push on veteran cemeteries, and those cemeteries are usually marked with every plot and have concrete monuments set in place. So you could be getting into a rather extensive survey with cemeteries. Water features, same deal. They may not be monumented, but your job is to locate the physical use of that, locating that shoreline, and wetlands are another example of where wetlands are a jurisdictional line and have to be surveyed to a survey grade, because if the land's being platted or something's happening afterwards, those lines will become lines on the plat, and they need to be done to survey grade accuracy. This slide speaks a lot to field plat calculated, measured positions, and how your responsibility is to show them both. Your responsibility is to show curve data, closures, everything that would allow. I always looked at it this way: if you can take that survey that you've done and you have enough control, enough distances, where did they start, what did they collect, if it's in a platted area, did they close out the entire tract or the entire block? If it's a boundary survey and it's sectional breakdown, did they tie in the monuments? Can I take that survey and go out and reproduce your drawing on the ground with the information that you've collected in order to produce the survey? And if the answer to that question is yes, you've done your job. So read through this slide, see if you have any questions, and I'll be happy to answer them. Again, this slide is a continuation of boundary descriptions, things that you need to show. Point of beginning, point of commencement. There is a difference between point of beginning and point of commencement, and I noticed that on some of your sketches and legals, there's a little bit of confusion there. Point of commencement is when you're coming in from, say, for example, a section corner, getting to where your description starts. Where your description starts is the point of beginning. Sometimes the point of beginning and the point of commencement are the same, but in many cases they're not. The directions, the distances, the curve data, the basis of bearings, if you're defining a water boundary, all of these things come into play when you're doing a survey, so that we still have the effects of accretion, reliction, avulsion, erosion, things that change property boundaries and things that don't. And if you are aware of this kind of information when you do your survey, you need to note it, or you need to bring it to the title attorney's purview, so that he can see that and make a decision on whether this is an issue that's going to cloud the title. Again, a continuation of the previous slide on boundary descriptions, things that are important, the adjoiners, continuity, gaps, hiatuses, overlaps, things that would be evident to you in the field is something that you need to show on the survey, because remember that the title attorney isn't seeing the actual property. If some of the dimensions differ slightly, what you decided to hold, what you decided not to hold, why you decided to hold it, these all need to be shown. All the buildings, any improvements on the site, things that may affect setbacks, things that may come into play, all need to be identified on the survey itself, so that all users of that survey know what they're getting. Again, as we move into easements and rights of way, access documents, things that recording references shown on your drawing, so that not only do you see that it's a right of way or an access tract or an easement, but you also have the recording information, usually coming right out of the title report, a summary of all of that. and how you list that. Such summary shall include the record information of such right-of-way, easement, or servitude, a statement indicating whether or not it's shown on the plat, or if it's related to a note. In other words, there are things like subject to, let me think of one here, subject to easement rights over an entire piece of parcel, mineral rights, trustees of the internal improvement funds, those kind of issues that you may not be able to actually draw on the drawing, but would be noted in the surveyor's report. Okay, that would be a blanket easement over everything. So that's something that you would note because you couldn't actually show it. So read through this slide. Again, if you have any questions, email me. We continue with the detail that needs to be shown on an ALTA survey. And again, many of the things that you're showing are things that are required under your state laws anyway. But as you get into, and when we get near the end and we go through table A, I'll explain each one of those one at a time so that you can get a better understanding of what an ALTA survey really means. Most of what you see here are things that you would have done anyway, but notes like no physical access to the public way. Land can't be landlocked, so if that's an issue, you would point it out. You are pointing out all of the facts that control the survey, and you're going to write a report at the end to back up all of your decisions of why you did the survey the way that you did. This slide defines many of the things that we discussed in 5J17. Continuing with the plotting of the map itself, minimum sizes, legible, standard scales, north arrows, graphic scales, all of the things that you normally would put on a drawing, as I said before, so that someone else could take that drawing and literally go out and survey the land as it exists today, and find no discrepancies between what you surveyed and what they see when they get there. Let's talk a little bit about the certification. Certifications are something that we said in earlier presentations, that as soon as you put your name and your seal on a drawing, it is certified. But many lenders want to see a written certification that defines who they're insuring it to, the name of the lender, the name of the insured, names of others who the client may want you to add to the survey. Remember, I said to leave et al. Off of everything. It's not successors and assigns is not something that you want to certify in a drawing. This is a certification for an ALTA survey. However, you must remember that your certification also has to include the state required certification. In this case, 472.027, okay, would also need to be in that certification. Now, as a caution here, I would warn you that over the years, many times the lenders will ask you to certify to things that you flat under your professional license can't certify to. I usually tell my staff to do this. Rewrite the certification to everything that you can certify to. Don't ever expose yourselves to things that you can't certify to, and rewrite it and add it to the drawing and sign and seal it and send it. And you will find sometimes they won't even look at it and it'll just go right on through. And other times they'll call you back and they'll say, we can't close with this certification. And they always do. They always close with that certification. Don't expose yourself liability-wise to something that you cannot certify to. Over the years, I have seen things as crazy as certifying to contemplated improvements. Remember, your job is to report what's there, not what is potentially or contemplated to be there. So be cautious there. This section simply talks about the deliverables and how, besides hard copies, and that is something that is negotiated in your contract, how many copies will you be providing? Will you be giving them digital copies? And if so, do you have to file them with any agency, office, or county, municipality, etc.? These are things that you will work out in the contract details anyway. Now we will take a look at Table A. Some of the things within Table A are already included in your state laws, and they're a standard, all right? But other things, depending on what the client actually needs for this survey, and what we'll do is we'll go through here and we'll define them one at a time, and I can give you a history of, is this something that's required anyway? Many times when they ask for an ALTA survey, they may not know or understand Table A at all. They just know that it's a buzzword. It's called ALTA, and that's what we want. So what I generally do is I go through and I mark off in Table A and send it to them all the things that would be a standard of practice survey in Florida. Then I let them come back and tell me that in addition, we need the following items. Because as soon as they start checking off multiple items, it's not a problem, it just adds to the cost of the survey, and they need to understand that. So let's look at number 1, monuments placed, okay, at all major corners of the boundary of the property unless already marked or referenced in existing monuments or witnesses. Number 1 is a given. It's already in your standards in your individual states. Number 2, address, if disclosed in record documents, are observed while conducting the survey. Well, that doesn't cost you any more money to do that, so you check it off. Flood zone information. If they want flood zone information, then we have to pull flood zone maps and we have to look that information up. Okay, so it's not a difficult task, but you don't have to check the box. Let them tell you that they want the box checked. Gross land area, or other areas as specified by the client. Well, gross land area is something you're showing anyway when you write your legal description, containing so many acres more or less. So that's an automatic check in my book because you're going to do that anyway. Number 5, vertical relief with the source of information, e.g. ground survey or aerial map, contoured interval, datum, and originating benchmark identified. That is not something you're going to check off immediately on an ALTA survey unless they tell you that they want a topographic survey. If they want a topographic survey, vertical relief, that's a given. You can either do it by shots, you can do it by a grid, you can do it by contours, you can do it however they want, but it's unless they're asking for a topographic survey, that box would remain unchecked until they tell you they need it, and then you would check the box. All of these things add to the cost of the survey, so it's important that they understand that and you have that conversation on the phone to explain that to them. So continuing on with Table A, item 6, if set forth